Now in 6.3 here, we're going to be multiplying and dividing radical expressions, and those are just expressions that have radical signs in them. And when multiplying radical expressions, you multiply the coefficients. That's the numbers outside. Those are the outside numbers. The outside numbers go together. And then multiply the radicands. Those are the inside numbers. So you multiply the outside numbers together, you multiply the inside numbers together, and then if you can, you simplify the result. So in number 1, we have the outside numbers, coefficients, 2 and 6. So we're going to have 2 times 6 is 12. We're going to multiply 3 times 5, get radical 15. Can we simplify the radical 15? No, we cannot. The only prime factors are 3 and 5, so your answer is 12 radical 15. Now in number 2, we have negative 2 times 6 is negative 12. We have radical 5 times radical 5 is radical 25. Well, what's the square root of 25? Right, it's 5. So we're going to have negative 12 times 5 is negative 60. In number 3, I have negative 2 times 5 is negative 10. Now I'm going to take a little bit of a shortcut on this one because what is the square root of 4? Anytime you see a perfect square, it'd be best probably to go ahead and take the square root of it. The square root of 4 is 2. We have a radical 5 left over. Numbers that are outside stay outside. Numbers that are inside stay inside until we can simplify it. We did that here with the square root of 4. Negative 10 times 2 is negative 20. We have negative 20 radical 5. In number 4, I have 3 times 2 is 6. I'm going to take 75 times 2 and get 150. Well, let's take the prime factors of 150. I get 2, 75, get 3, 25, 5, and 5. So I'm going to have 6 times 5 radical 6 is left over, 30 radical 6. Now, we were talking earlier about the 3 things that would make a radical expression simplified, and number 1 was not being able to have a factor under the radical that was a perfect square. Like 75 has a factor that's a perfect square. 25 is a perfect square, so we couldn't leave it like that. Number 2 was making sure we didn't have a fraction underneath the radical sign. And number 3 is not having a radical in the denominator. When you have a radical in the denominator, cannot leave your answer like this, because if you were to try to take the square root of 6 in your calculator, you would get this really big number, or I should say a number that has many decimal points to it, and decimal places. It'll be 2 point whatever, and it'll just ramble on forever and ever. It'll never stop. It'll never repeat, because the square root of 6 is an irrational number. We can't have an irrational number in the denominator. We have to make it rational. That's the reason why this process is called rationalize the denominator. And it's much easier than it sounds, because all we need to do is take this fraction, 3 over radical 6, and we're going to multiply it by 1. Sounds simple, right? The only thing is, whatever the radical is in the denominator, here's how we're going to make the 1. We're going to take the radical 6 over radical 6. Now keep in mind that radical 6 over radical 6 is 1, and we're multiplying this fraction times 1. That does not change the value. We're only going to change how it looks. Another thing you want to keep in mind is that you have a numerator and you have a denominator. Keep these things separate. Whatever's in the numerator stays in the numerator. Whatever's in the denominator stays in the denominator. And what do you have in the numerator? You have 3 times radical 6. Then what do you have in the denominator? You have radical 36. Well, what is the square root of 36? So in the numerator, again, you have 3 radical 6. In the denominator, you have 6. Now, the only thing here is we need to always reduce fractions. Any numbers outside the fraction can be reduced, so that would be radical 6 over 2. There's your final answer. In number 6, again, we need to rationalize the denominator. Try to reduce fractions first. Try to simplify any radicals that you can first. Radical 7 doesn't get reduced. Radical 2 doesn't get reduced. We can't reduce the fraction 7 over 2, so we need to rationalize the denominator. We're going to multiply this fraction times 1, but it's going to be whatever the denominator is, whatever radical is in the denominator, over itself. Now, you have two different parts of the fraction here. You have a numerator and you have a denominator. What do you have in the numerator? Well, radical 7 times radical 2 is radical 14. What do you have in the denominator? Radical 2 times radical 2 is radical 4. Simplify radical 14. Well, you only have 7 and 2. That doesn't work, so it stays radical 14. But what do you have in the denominator? Radical 4, which is 2. Number 7, we have 5 over 2 radical 8. Now you might be thinking that, yeah, we need to rationalize the denominator. Take radical 8 over radical 8, and you most certainly could do that and get to the final answer. But what I'm going to do first is I'm going to simplify the radical 8 first. So here's this 2, and radical 8 is 2 radical 2. So actually what I need to start with here is 5 over 4 radical 2. Now this is going to be much easier to simplify because when I multiply everything times radical 2 over radical 2, in the numerator 5 radical 2, in the denominator 4 times 2 is 8. There's your final answer. In number 8, when you take 3 radical 7 and square it, keep in mind that you're taking the parentheses times itself. Numbers outside stay outside. Numbers inside stay inside. What's the square root of 49? 7. 9 times 7, 63. Number 9, we can't have that fraction, 15 over 2, under the radical like that. That's the second bullet in simplifying radical expressions. So we have to take radical 2 over radical 2. What do you have in the numerator? Radical 30. What do you have in the denominator? Well, radical 2 times radical 2 is radical 4. What is the square root of 4? 2. Numbers inside the radical cannot be combined with numbers outside the radical, so this remains radical 30 over 2. 2 radical 8 times 2 radical 8. 4 radical 64. 4 times 8, 32. Number 11, rationalize the denominator. Radical 5 over radical 5. In the numerator, radical 30, and in the denominator, 5. And in number 12, radical y over radical y. In the numerator, radical 3y, and the denominator is y. What we're going to do now in multiplying using the distributive property is just taking what we just now learned and basically doing it twice, because what we're going to be doing is we're going to take the number that is outside the parentheses, whatever it is, and if there are 2 or more terms inside the parentheses, just like before, you've studied distributive property before, we're going to be taking a times b, bringing in the plus sign, and then we're going to be taking a times c. Now, being that you're relatively new at multiplying radical expressions, here's what I really need you to concentrate on, is taking that number that's outside the radical 8 and showing me multiplying it times radical 2. I mean, write those two things down. That is a times sign there. We're going to be bringing down the plus sign, and then you're going to be taking that same radical 8 and write this down. I'm telling you right now, until you know exactly what you're doing on these, write it down. Do not take any shortcuts. Now, because of this plus sign, that gives me two different problems I'm going to be working on. I'm going to be multiplying radical 8 times radical 2. And how do we multiply those? Anything that's inside gets multiplied together. So you have radical 16. You're going to bring down the plus sign. And the numbers that are outside stay outside. Numbers that are inside get multiplied together. Now you still have two terms that you're going to be simplifying here. Radical 16 is 4 plus 5 times radical 64 is 8. Not radical 8, it's just once you take the square root of a number, the radical sign is gone. So you're going to have 4 plus 5 times 8 is 40, so your final answer, 44. Number 2, write down the 3 radical 2 times the 2 radical 8. Bring down the minus sign. And then you're going to be taking 3 radical 2 times the 3 radical 24. Numbers that are outside stay outside. 3 times 2 is 6. Numbers that are inside get multiplied together as well. Radical 16. Minus. Numbers that are outside get multiplied together. 3 times 3 is 9. Times radical 2 times 24 is 48. Now the square root of 16 is 4. You can simplify that and get 6 times 4. Minus 9 times, now break up the 48 into 16 times 3. 24 minus 9, now the square root of 16 is 4, so you're going to have 9 times 4, and then you're going to have your radical 3 left over. The numbers that are outside get multiplied together. Your final answer, 24 minus 9 times 4, 36, and then radical 3. 24 minus 36, radical 3. Write it down. 2 times radical 3 plus 2 times 4 radical 5. 2 radical 3 plus 8 radical 5. Final answer. Number 4, radical 6 times radical 3. Bring down the minus sign. Then radical 6 times 2 radical 6. Numbers that are outside stay outside. Numbers that are inside stay inside. Radical 18. Minus 2 is on the outside, radical 36 on the inside. Radical 18, going to be taking 9 times 2, so the square root of 9 is 3. You have a radical 2 left over. Minus 2 times 6. 3 radical 2 minus 12. Final answer. Radical 5 times radical 5. You would not go wrong if you wrote down the two things that you're multiplying together. What am I multiplying together here? Radical 5 and radical 5. Write them down. Then you're going to be taking radical 5 times radical 2. Write them down. You get the square root of 25 minus the square root of 10. The square root of 25 is 5. 5 minus radical 10. Final answer. Radical 2 times 3 radical 7. Bring down the plus sign. Radical 2 times 2 radical 5. Numbers that are outside stay outside. 3 radical 14 plus 2 radical 10. Final answer. Now the reason why we're doing this is because we're getting ready to multiply binomials. Multiplying binomials. That's 2 terms times 2 terms. Now what's the process that we usually take to multiply 2 terms times 2 terms? Well, that's FOIL. Only I'm not going to exactly use FOIL this time. Tell you right now, when you try to FOIL 2 radical expressions, things can get pretty ugly pretty fast. So I'm going to show you a little bit different way, and hopefully this will make sense also. What I want you to do is make yourself a box and make window panes like this. And the 5 radical 2 goes in the first column, and the negative 8 radical 6 goes in the second. Then you're going to do 14 and put it here, and then the 5 radical 3 you're going to put it here. Now this first box is going to come from taking 5 radical 2 times 14. I'm going to multiply these two things together and put it in this box. That's 70 radical 2. And then I'm going to take negative 8 radical 6, and I'm going to multiply it times 14. This box comes from multiplying these two, the 14 and the negative 8 radical 6. What do I get there? Negative 8 times 14 is negative 120 radical 6. Then I'm going to take 5 radical 2 times 5 radical 3. Numbers outside stay outside, 25. Numbers inside stay inside, radical 6. Nothing I can do to simplify that one. And then negative 8 radical 6 times 5 radical 3. Negative 8 times 5 is negative 40. I get radical 18. But the radical 18 can be simplified. So we've got to take negative 40 times radical 9 times 2, negative 40 times 3 radical 2, negative 120 radical 2. So my four terms are 70 radical 2 minus 120 radical 6 plus 25 radical 6 minus 120 radical 2. Now I'm adding or subtracting, whichever the case may be, four different terms here, two pair of which are like terms, meaning this, 70 radical 2, I can subtract 120 radical 2 and get negative 50 radical 2. I can take negative 120 radical 6 plus 25 radical 6 and get negative 87 radical 6. Final answer. Now in number 2, I'm going to do the same thing, but before I start, I see that I have a radical 12 here, and I can simplify that to 2 radical 3. And the 4 radical 8 is 4 radical 4 times 2. The square root of 4 is 2, so 4 times 2 radical 2, 8 radical 2 here. So I take my box, take my window panes, and I'll have radical 2, 3 radical 3, 2 radical 3, and negative 8 radical 2. And start multiplying. Radical 2 times 2 radical 3, 2 radical 6. 3 radical 3 times 2 radical 3 is 6 radical 9. That's 6 times 3, 18. Radical 2 times negative 8 radical 2, that's negative 8 radical 4. Negative 8 times 2 is negative 16. And then 3 radical 3 times negative 8 radical 2, negative 24 radical 6. So I have 2 radical 6 plus 18 minus 16 minus 24 radical 6. Now I need to combine like terms. 18 minus 16 is 2. 2 radical 6 minus 24 radical 6 is negative 22 radical 6. Now I prefer to write it this way because I want to, if I only have the one radical, I'd like to end with it. Otherwise, if you could have written negative 22 radical 6 plus 2. Number 3, window panes. I have 2 and negative 4 radical 2. I have 2 and positive 4 radical 2. 2 times 2 is 4. Negative 4 radical 2 times 2, negative 8 radical 2. 2 times 4 radical 2 is 8 radical 2. Negative 4 radical 2 times positive 4 radical 2, negative 16 radical 4. Radical 4 is 2, so negative 16 times 2, negative 32. If you'll notice, the negative 8 radical 2, positive 8 radical 2, those guys will get combined, and when you do, they cancel each other out. There are no more radical 2's. Do not write one down, because the coefficient for radical 2 would now be 0. There are 0 radical 2's. And if you wrote down a radical 2, that would mean that there would be at least one radical 2 there. We don't have any left, so don't write down any radical 2's. We're just going to take 4 minus 32 and get our answer of negative 28. In number 4, squaring a binomial means you're going to take that binomial, and remember that you're multiplying it times itself. So what will it take to multiply these two things? It's going to take window panes. So we're going to have radical 3, negative radical 6, radical 3, and negative radical 6. Radical 3 times radical 3 is radical 9, which is 3. Negative radical 6 times radical 3 is negative radical 18, which is negative 3 radical 2. And radical 3 times negative radical 6 is the same thing. Again, negative 3 radical 2. And then negative radical 6 times radical 6, negative radical 6, is positive radical 36, which is 6. So we're going to have 3 minus 3 radical 2, minus 3 radical 2 again, plus 6. Now, do the 3 radical 2's cancel out this time? No. In order for them to cancel, one would have to be positive and one would have to be negative. This is negative 3 minus 3. So we're going to have 3 plus 6 is 9 minus 6 radical 2. Final answer. In number 5, radical 45 can be simplified. 3 radical 5. Radical 12 can be simplified. 2 radical 3. So it's going to take window panes. 2 radical 3. Negative 3 radical 5. 2 radical 3 and 2 radical 6. Multiply the two numbers that you have that will form that corner. 2 radical 3 times 2 radical 3. 4 radical 9. 4 times 3 is 12. Negative 3 radical 5 times 2 radical 3. Negative 6 radical 15. 2 radical 3 times 2 radical 6. 4 radical 18. 4 times 3 radical 2 is 12 radical 2. Negative 3 radical 5 times 2 radical 6. Negative 6 radical 30. Now we need to check to see if we have any like terms. We have 12 minus 6 radical 15 plus 12 radical 2 minus 6 radical 30. Radical 30 cannot be simplified. We don't have any like terms, so this is our final answer. And lastly, number 6. Remember, squaring a binomial means to take it, radical 5 plus radical 7, times itself, radical 5 plus radical 7. So here's radical 5, here's radical 7, radical 5, and radical 7. Radical 5 times radical 5 is 5. Radical 7 times radical 5 is radical 35. Here we have radical 35. Radical 7 times radical 7 is radical 49, which is 7. So here are your 4 terms. 5 plus radical 35, can't be simplified, plus radical 35 plus 7. 5 plus 7 is 12, plus, what are the coefficients here? 1 here and 1 here, plus 2 radical 35. Final answer. Good luck on your assignment. We'll see you in class.